All right, and I will keep updating the attendance list as we go. So, just by word of caution, I am going to turn in sketches to our sketch coordinator on Thursday. I'm going to do fifth grade and eighth grade at the same time. And you should hear usually within a couple of weeks, but starting Thursday after school, my vacation responder is going to be on. I'm not going to be on vacation, I'm going to be on medical leave, but my autoresponder will be on. So if there is an issue, I try to take attendance in the moment, but sometimes an issue occurs. Shoot me an email, ignore the vacation responder, and in the middle of May, when I resurface, I will get that taken care of. So if I goofed on yours, if I missed one, that's okay. I will get it taken care of. Just shoot me an email when you get your sketches. Almost everybody missed one. There's a couple of people that have the perfect attendance here. Like I've got Lisa, I've got you down for all five of that or all six of them. And same with Mary Sue Jensen. But if I did miss a night, just let me know and I will get it taken care of when I resurface. So, let's see. So, welcome everybody. It's the final Giants Network session, and I'm super glad that you guys are here. Phil and I are both Oh, cool. Phil and I have both put some time into going over the fifth grade unit that we're going to outline tonight, though we didn't do it together as often as we normally do with this particular unit. One part, it was in good shape already. One part, Dave had no time on his calendar getting ready for 6 weeks off. But overall, the unit's in really good shape, and we made some tweaks and additions to some of the material. Karen's dog is the MVP of the evening here. Hello, puppy. Ah, that looks like a good boy. So, yes. So we are excited to roll tonight's unit out, and just like always, when we're done, we're done. So that is always a fun here. And I know spring is when lots of additional things start taking place, spring sports. So again, we appreciate your time and attention, and I'm just gonna launch right into the units proper. So going to share my Safari screen because every time I do this, I get a little bit better at recognizing, oh, they don't need to see my entire screen, just certain parts of it. Um, if I were to ask people today, if I were to say, hey, everybody in the Zoom tonight, how should we balance power here in the United States? I think we would all have some different ideas. I think we might agree on some stuff. Honestly, I think we might agree on more things than we may think we might all agree on. That's the interesting part of being an American, right? It's a geographically large and complex country, and different areas and different regions have different beliefs and things that they drive them. But at the end of the day, we're all sort of united under, well, it's right there in the title, right? The United States of America. So, um, you know, just think about how many different people you know in your life. How many of you know someone who doesn't think we should pay taxes? You may be that person. You're like, my tax dollars. Come on. How many of you want the government to step in and tell you someone has to live in your house? I'm thinking Third Amendment here, to the Constitution. Yeah, no, you're not up for that, Elizabeth? No? Not okay. Well, I mean, I guess if it were like Jennifer Aniston or Cindy Crawford, maybe I'd be like, oh, okay, she can stay. We'll get the guest room out. But, like just in general, some rando, probably not. Dave, mental note, edit that part out because embarrassing. All right. I think we can all agree that Congress has our best interests at heart all the time, and none of us have ever once ever had any notes for any single one of them in regards to laws, policies, education reforms, state assessments, etc. That was supposed to be funny. Hopefully, some of you are chuckling, joking. Yes. Okay. Excellent. So, that is the purpose of this unit, is to start getting fifth graders to think about how do we balance power. In our last unit, we talked about the Revolutionary War, and I am here to tell you that even though this unit has a lot of stuff in it, this is also a unit where you can reclaim some time this year because you absolutely should spend a great deal of time teaching the American Revolution. It's super important for everything that comes next, both this year and next. And in a lot of cases, you've covered a few of the standards from this next unit already. This unit is designed to be a little bit shorter and close the year. And we design it that way on purpose because, again, we know state testing occupies a great deal of time. Um, so let's take a second to talk about our compelling question. How do we balance power? The founding fathers didn't get it right out of the gate. The war ended, and we needed to find a way to bring these independent states together under one nation. Everyone had some representatives, and this was truly the question that the founders grappled with. Every state had their own interests to look out for, and they did not all align. How many of you have seen Hamilton? Or yeah, it's absolutely wonderful. It's on Disney Plus. If you have not, totally recommend watching it. Recommend even more seeing it live. I can tell you, as a Wharton Center season subscriber, that's my Christmas present from my mom every year, and we just re-upped our package for next year. And in June of next year, it will be at Wharton Center. So definitely make plans to see it. The tickets aren't available to the public yet, just the season subscribers, but definitely worth it. And there's a whole bunch of songs that really illustrate the different interests that different founding fathers had and how their state sort of influenced them on that front. So the first part of this unit is going to be centered around the first system of government that we employed, the Articles of Confederation. So the first lesson is what were the Articles of Confederation and why did they fail? And this question guides our first lesson. We actually have students take a time to look at the articles themselves to see what they did do, to see what they didn't do. And this can be a tall order for a fifth grader, but we'll get into some ways that you might support that learning in just a minute. No discussion of the Articles of Confederation is complete without taking a deep dive into the problems that emerged under the Articles of Confederation. And we've got a great presentation on just that, the problems that showed up under the Articles of Confederation. Wanted to really quickly, I forgot, right here, tried to think a little bit about student sizes and group numbers for chunking and things like that. So depending on the number of articles you want your kids to read, we've got some chunking ideas here. So if you want them to read all of them, do it in 5 groups. Give one group articles 1 through 4, give another group 5 through 6, 7 through 8. 9 should be on its own, and then 10 through 13. So in terms of breaking this out, we would like you to do it with students, and we'll talk a little bit more about how this goes when we get to that part of it. But we've given you some suggestions for chunking all of that out. So we also get a little bit after the problems of the Articles of Confederation. We get into Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion is important, so we're going to spend a little bit of time here. Depending on how you're doing time-wise, though, our offerings let you skip some of the steps here if you're pressed for time, and we'll get into what that looks like tonight as well. And all of this rounds out our pretty robust discussion on the Articles of Confederation. Lesson 2 changes gears just a little bit, and I absolutely love it when Google Docs does this to me. It's like, hey, I need lesson 2. It's like, hey, we're going to give you a blank screen. So lesson 2, let me try this again. There we go. So lesson 2 gets into the idea of what issues did those in attendance at the Constitutional Convention face. The founders realized the Articles of Confederation were not working. They brought some people together to talk about some ways that they might strengthen them or revise them. And what issues did those in attendance at the Constitutional Convention face becomes the question that we really look at here. Those of you who are very used to this content know they didn't figure it out overnight. Lots of different plans were discussed, and we're going to take you through all of them. Well, not all of them. We're going to take you through 3 of them, the 3 big ones. Sorry, there's way more than the 3 big ones that your textbooks tend to talk about, but we're going to take you through the 3 most popular ones. And we'll get into some of the compromises that were made, though more on that in just a minute, so that we can sort of talk out how the Constitution was structured. And then in terms of what compromises, so that's unit 3, what compromises were or lesson 3, what compromises were reached at the Constitutional Convention. We do start this conversation in lesson 2, but we complete it here by talking more about the Bill of Rights, because the Bill of Rights was really the carrot that got the states to move along and say, okay, we will ratify this, we will bring it together. So lesson 3 continues the idea of compromise by talking about the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights truly was designed at the time to reflect a lot of the problems that the founders sort of kicked the can down the road on. But not all of them, because the theme of the entire 8th grade course, as as anyone who would tune in tomorrow night would know, is kicking the can down the road. And that's like Phil and I have done this through the whole Giants rollout for 8th grade. It's one can kick after another, because there are certain issues that did not get solved either by the Bill of Rights or at the Constitutional Convention. Most definitely slavery. So the colony scenario that you guys are going to have in this particular, if I go all the way back to the first one, the colony scenario that you guys are going to talk about in this particular unit is centered around new beginnings. Basically, you and the other colonies have just won the Revolutionary War, and you're now beginning the hard work of putting together a new country. How will you and the other colonies in your classroom unite to ensure everyone's survival? Create a plan for governing. Really, you're just going to give kids this scenario in lesson 1. We indicate a point in lesson 2 where you might choose to wrap it up if you don't want to just completely wrap it up in lesson 1. But this will conclude the colonies game for the year. The kids will have grappled with all of the major issues that the colonists grappled with. They will have arrived at, it's the 1,000 monkeys principle, right? 1,000 monkeys at 1,000 typewriters will eventually recreate the works of Shakespeare. Some of the kids groups will have come up with a very similar solution to what our colonists did. Some of them will have gone their own path. It's all totally okay. The idea is to get them thinking like a colonist. So on the very first day, we need you to ask students this question so that we can get them in the right headspace. We'll let it play out through all of lesson 1 before returning to their solutions either at the end of lesson 1 or at the beginning of lesson 2. So that's kind of your bird's eye flyby overview of this final unit. And before I get into Articles of Confederation and the problems with the Articles of Confederation and Shays' Rebellion, what questions might you have for me about this unit? We're already 2 minutes ahead of schedule, so that's always a great place to be. Let's launch into the Articles of Confederation. So you'll notice that the first thing that comes out in our intro, after our intro to the unit for students, is the Articles of Confederation. And if you read the teacher's notes, it's not as specific as some of our stuff can be. In this particular case, here's what Dave Johnson might do. You've got stuff with Open Book Project to help you get students to understand the history behind this. And our project actually linked the Articles of Confederation. So go through as many of the points in the articles as possible and ask students with each one, so why might this be a thing? Why was this important? You could start right out with Article 1, which reads, "The style of this confederacy shall be the United States of America." Why was this important? Why might this be a piece that they keep in mind? But another thing for you to keep in mind too is we chunked this out for you. So if you wanted kids to read this in a group, you can decide how many of these articles do I want them to read, and you can use this sort of as a guidepost, at least to get your thinking going. So if you want them to read all of them, you're looking at about 5 groups, and you can chunk it this way. If you want them to read all of them, but you want the groups to be a little bit smaller, I believe I based this off of a roughly 30 kid classroom. So This is another way that you could chunk it. And if you only wanted them to read some of them, I tried to pull out the ones that might be the most important. So that bottom one, if you only want them to read some of them, you could do it with 5 groups and have one group do Articles 1 through 4, one group do Article 5, one group do Article 7, one group do Article 10, and one group do Article 12, because the first 4 are relatively short. So you could have them do it in groups as kind of a jigsaw activity, or thinking about where a lot of our kids are, just talk it out with them. If especially if you're doing it like on a testing day or something along those lines, we want to keep the rigor down on those days so that they do the best that they can do on those really useful tests that we love so much, that we love to dedicate so much time and attention to every single year, because they're really good measurement tools for the yeah, I can't even finish that sentence. Lisa's like, yeah, Dave, just stop talking. Just stop. You're embarrassing yourself. So, you can also talk it out with kids if you don't want to do it as a jigsaw approach. My point in leaving this part as up in the air as we did was I wanted to give you the flexibility based off of what's happening. So, um, but if you continue to go through this with students, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this Confederacy expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. This is like the basis of the 10th Amendment, right? It's like, hey, if we didn't put something specifically in the Constitution, that right and power belongs to the states. So there's an element of that here in the Articles of Confederation that you might choose to jump back to in lesson 3 when we get into the Bill of Rights, and particularly that 10th Amendment. The said states hereby severally enter into a firm league of friendship. This is strong language to put out for kids. League of friendship does not sound like organized, systematic government, does it? It's more like, hey, we're going to be friends and we're going to get along and maybe we'll fight sometimes and yada, yada, yada. But it doesn't sound like a strong system of government. So this, excuse me, might be a point to weigh in with students and say, hey, you know what? What do you think this language is here for? What do you think it means? And you can get further into the weeds with it. For their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare, binding themselves to assist each other against all force offered to or attacks made upon them, yada, yada, yada. And some of this language finds its way back into the Constitution in different parts as well. So, again, that's why I like having Article 3 in all of the potential scenarios so that you can, kind of go back to some of these things when we get to the Constitution, because they didn't completely scrap it. It just ended up in some different forms. Article 4, the better to secure and perpetuate mutual friendship. Again, mutual friendship is not language that pops up in the Constitution. So this is a very different conversation than we'll have in lessons 2 and 3. So Article 4 gets into that. And it's a little bit longer. So for that one group, it would be the last one. And that group would probably be where I would put some of your higher students because it is the most text. The rest of them are shorter, but not quite as long as this first one. Then you get into Article 5, which gets into managing the general interests. You get into Article 6. No state without the consent of the United States shall send any embassy or receive any embassy from or enter into any conference, agreement, alliance, or treaty with any king or prince or state, yada, yada, yada. Basically, you're not allowed to make a treaty with other countries. That's got to come from, that's one of the powers that we are going to leave right with the centralized national government, which is not super strong. Article 7, and it goes on. Article 7, when land forces are raised by any state for the common defense, all officers or under the rank of colonel shall be appointed by the legislature of each state. So here's what we do if there is a conflict with a foreign power. Article 8, charges of war, etc. So if we're going to declare war on anybody, here's where it has to come from. It's got to come from the Congress of the United States. We're going to give them that power. Article 9, lays out a little bit more about Congress and how it will be structured. And then that goes on for a while as well. So, and then Article 10, the Committee of States or any nine of them shall be authorized to execute in the recess of Congress such powers of Congress as the United States in Congress assembled. By the consent, yes, good old legalese. That's basically saying to get anything done, we need at least nine of the states to sign on board. Now, I want you to think about that for just a second. We have 50 states now, and there were, those 13 original colonies. Could we get nine states to sign on board to anything today? I do not know. I honestly do not know watching the news anymore if we could. So nine was a tall order at the time, and nine is probably still a tall order today. If we had to, let's say, adjust this for inflation, so to speak, and say, okay, what would nine look like now that there's 50 of us? That would be a good maybe 80%. So 80% of the country would have to agree on something. So if I put it in those numbers, do you think we can get 80% of the United States to agree on one thing right now? I don't know. Honestly, I'm glad we don't have to figure it out because I don't know. All right, so you get the point and the purpose of this. It's really to get kids to look at the Articles of Confederation so that we can have a stronger conversation about we can have a stronger conversation about the Constitution when that time comes. Doing some of these things, you'll note that there were some really progressive, interesting pieces, but there were also some places where potential problems might creep up. So this is a strong preface to the part that we go to next, which is a bare bones. Again, it's a Dave Johnson PowerPoint. It's not a Phil Gershmal PowerPoint. You can easily tell the difference by the opening slide. And while Phil has designed it so that anybody can run it, which I love, I personally have never been able to match Phil's prowess at being able to do that. So mine are a little more Spartan, but you have a copy button. You can make a copy of this and you can add to it anything that you want to add to it. And in this particular case, we've got one on the problems that came under the Articles of Confederation. The first one is that states didn't pass this immediately. So it took a little bit of time for 12 states to approve the document. And then Maryland held out another 2 years. So this is a problem because it's already suggesting to us as we go through and read this, as we go through and learn about this, that not all the states are going to get along and be able to to get on board with this right away. The central government was designed to be weak, and wherever you fall in this camp now, there are certain things that a centralized government has to be able to respond to quickly. And we didn't delegate a lot of powers to the central government in the Articles of Confederation. Everything was resting in this alliance of the states, which honestly, the historian in me feels like this is how it had to be. Like we had to try this and we had to learn our lesson before we could build something that was a little more robust and flexible. So the central government it's not a bug, it's a feature. It was designed to be very, very weak. Congress had one house and each state had one vote. We run into a similar problem when we start to look at the different the different compromises that creep up at the Constitutional Convention. Bigger states didn't necessarily think it was a great idea that a state the size of Rhode Island had just as much power as they did. So we solved this a different way with the Constitution, but with Articles of Confederation, there was one house and each state had one vote. 9 of 13 states had to vote for a law to change. This was a high supermajority. It would be very difficult to pass legislation. So you always, if you've ever written new lesson plans, you drive home going, oh, I can think of 5 or 6 things that I might do differently with this lesson plan. And if you have the opportunity to teach it again right away, you go right back in and you teach it differently and you try some of those different things. But with this, we came together and we crafted this system of government, and we made it very hard to change. And so in execution, 9 of 13, like I mentioned before, was a tall order. And basically to amend it, so passing a law is one thing. To amend the existing structure, all 13 states had to agree on the change. There's not a single issue today that all 50 states would agree on. I could say, here's my new constitutional amendment to give everyone a free puppy and a lifetime supply of puppy food. And everyone would not agree that that was a good idea. So, it becomes a very difficult to amend the system of government. There were no taxes. And again, this is something that may cause a lot of people joy, but our tax dollars do fund things. So there was no way for the government to raise money. Worse yet, states and even the central government, had some debts and hard to pay when you don't have a common currency, and when there's no tax dollars coming into your weak by design central government. Your weak by design central government is that much weaker. States were able to handle some foreign affairs themselves. They weren't able to enter into treaties. But if you've got Virginia posturing for something against New York, that's obviously going to cause some conflicts. Everyone had their own money. It's not like today where I could travel Europe and I can use the euro almost anywhere. Every state had their own money. All that money had different values and different exchange rates and different rates of inflation and things like that. So there was no common currency, which could cause some problems. And again, every one of these slides, we ask kids to think about, well, why might this be a problem? So while I'm going through this slide deck with you very quickly, this could take a whole class period with your kids where you're like, here's another problem. Why is this a problem? And then, yeah, everyone owned debt. So if we have no central currency and each state has their own debts and their own money system, and we have debts that we have to pay, how do we pay this off? So major problems. And at the end of this, looking back at students' notes, we ask them to say, okay, look back at all these problems. Which one do you think was the biggest problem? And which one do you think was the smallest problem and why? And then do a quick partner, have them partner with their peers, and then, do a class discussion. So that kind of walks you through the problems with the Articles of Confederation. And like I said, while it is Spartan and bare bones, feel free to make a copy of it, make it look a little more pretty. And remember, the power is in this question at the bottom of every one of these slides. Why might this be a problem? The final thing we get into is Shays' Rebellion. So we tackle Shays' Rebellion in several different ways. There's some activities. Students will also read it about it in open book or the textbook of your choice. But we also give you this handout, which I spent some time developing the first time around. I only made some very small, tiny tweaks and changes to it this time. Um, it's a handout on some of the major issues surrounding Shays' Rebellion, and you can use it to discuss with your students because it really identifies three major issues that, again, also stems back to the problems with the Articles of Confederation. So, all three of these are designed to be very short, and again, can provide a really good launch pad for discussion with your students. So that is lesson 1 in a nutshell. We're still a little bit ahead of time, which is awesome. Before I move on to lesson 2, anybody have any questions, thoughts, comments about this portion? Lesson 1? Mary Sue, welcome. I was powerless to help you. I was getting the emails as they were coming in and I was talking, so I couldn't respond to them, but I'm glad you were able to make it.
I don't think we ever have spent any time on the Articles of Confederation. So I really like this because it looks like it's very user friendly, and maybe I'll actually give it a day or two this year.
It was kind of important to us when we developed the units to do that dive because I never studied it in great depth either. It was always kind of like yeah, we tried it and didn't work. So I'm like, yeah, no reason to study it. But when I really did a deep dive into it to design these the first time around, I was like, all these little hints and echoes of what would become the Constitution, and it was really cool. And now I wish I could go back and do a different senior thesis as an undergrad, comparing these two, because I haven't seen a lot of work doing that. And I think it's worth doing with kids. So thank you for that feedback, Karen. I appreciate it. All right. If you recall, a couple of rollouts ago, I said you can tell where we are in the evening by how many tabs are left open in Dave's Safari window. So I just closed a bunch of them. Let's get into lesson two. So lesson two is on calling a constitutional convention. And as I scroll through it here and give you whiplash, you can see it's a little bit longer. But this is where some of the familiar stuff that you're probably looking for is going to come. Keep in mind there is an additional resource here that we recommend, and it's the book We're Writing the Constitution. And I'll get a little bit more into that and what you might choose to do with that. But it's here at the very, very beginning of this lesson that it's your final call on colonies. So if you haven't had your students finish their colonies game scenario as part of lesson one, before you really get into the content of lesson two, give them some time to revisit their colony group solution to their problem, talk out any new proposed solutions, and then bring that forward. And colonies is complete. You can thank your young colonists and young scholars for all the work they did to lay the solid foundation for a new country, and it's going to be good. So once you've completed that, I like to preface this next part by bringing out a copy of your classroom rules. This can be a very humbling but awesome experience that you can do to lead into a discussion of why we scrapped the Articles of Confederation. So pull out your classroom rules and tell students, hey, we are going to review the rules that are currently in use in this classroom. The idea is I really, as a teacher, would like to get some feedback from you guys. You guys lived under these rules for this whole school year, and I want to do whatever it takes to make them the best possible rules they can be for next school year. So preface it with that positive piece, like you've lived under these rules, so let's talk them out. But that's also why I warn you, this could be a very humbling activity if you choose to do it, because I taught middle school, and middle schoolers will tell you their opinions, but it starts on the upper grades, and it starts in the upper elementary grades, and it's probably going to start here as well. So it's a humbling experience. Do it with the aura of self-improvement, and don't take anything too personally if they're like, "Ah!" But ask students to brainstorm a list of things that they feel like might need to be revisited with your classroom rules. So bring them up, display them on the board, point out where they live in the classroom again, and ask students in little pair groups to brainstorm things that could be revisited. Give them some time to talk it out, and then let them share their thoughts. And then when you've shared their thoughts, start to throw out some scenarios. I listed a couple in the teacher's notes here, but, say things like, lunch is at 11:45, and at 11:40, several students get up and start to form a lunch line. This never happened in middle school, ever. Never. Um, Ever. So say, do our classroom rules say anything about this? And if so, or if not, do we need to make a classroom rule about it? Um, let's say, and you can get into some of your classroom procedures here too, which are obviously different from rules. Let's say a student has a cold and came to school anyway. They're sneezing and they need a Kleenex, and they get up and blow their nose with a Kleenex from the counter while the teacher's talking. Should they have done that? Is there a classroom rule about this? Does there need to be a classroom rule about this? For me personally, I used to say, nope, stay in your seats, until the one time I had a kid sneeze, and then there was, the snot rolling down his chin because they had and I'm like, okay, new rule, guys. If you need to get up and just do it discreetly, get up and go. So maybe that doesn't need to be a rule. Maybe that's a policy shift. Student needs to sharpen their pencil during direct instruction. They get up and sharpen their pencil. Is there a classroom rule about this? Does there need to be a classroom rule about this? Start to throw some of those ideas out to them, and then get a little more ridiculous with them as they go forward, so that you can start to see that, oh yeah, no, that could be something that would actually happen. Gosh, our classroom rules really don't seem to address this. So start to touch on what you're doing with this is you're starting to touch on a very basic form of the power of authority and the power to do something without authority. So right up on the board, classroom, school, school district, community, and say under each one, okay, who has power in a classroom? They're probably going to say a teacher has power in the classroom. If you've got a paraprofessional in your classroom during that hour, maybe they have some of the power and authority in a classroom. Um, that would be what I would expect to hear from there. Now, what about in a school building, in our little elementary school building, or if you're in a middle school building, because some of you are in a middle school building, in our middle school building, who has power in our school? They will probably say teachers again, but now they might bring your principal, or if you have an assistant principal into the mix, they might say, you know, Mrs. Vanderhoof has power. Mr. Mumby has power in our school. And then keep this going with what about the school district? I don't usually expect elementary school students to know that your school district has a superintendent and a school board and things like that, but they might. It's sometimes about 50-50 in that regard in terms of the experiences that I've had. So talk about that across the school district, talk about it across the community. And again, throw out some ridiculous scenarios. So what if I decide to do this? Do I have the power and authority to say that I can do weird, ridiculous thing X, Y, or Z? So this is a lead into basically, some of the conversations we had with the Constitutional Convention. Now, it's also here. Pardon me, there's something weird on my tongue that I can't get off, and now I'm gonna have to edit this part out too. Also here, we're writing the Constitution listed, but we don't have it linked. Nor can we legally point you in the direction of where to find it online. But I have heard from a friend of a friend who works at another curriculum project in a different state that if you Google search the book, we're writing the Constitution, and click on the video tab of your Google search results, you might find some interesting search results should you not already have a copy of You're Writing the Constitution in your own professional library of your classroom. That said, it's also not super expensive, so it might be something you could approach your principal about saying, hey, you know what, I've got this really cool literature connection for social studies that I can link back to my literacy time in the day. Would you be willing to get me 2 or 3 copies of this, $20 book off of Amazon so that I can do this really cool lesson? That is also an option, but we cannot legally provide you with any copies of it, and I can't even link you out to a video of it because the last time we did that, it was with one of the 6th grade Giants rollouts. And as Phil knows, over the summer, we got a copyright takedown notice, and it ended up working out fine. As soon as I reached out to the person whose stuff we used, they were like, oh yeah, a curriculum project. Yes, we want people to learn more about it. But it was all automated via Google. So we can't give you any of that information, but we can lead you, my friends, I won't call you horses, we can lead you to water. And if you choose to drink from said water, that is a choice that you make on your own. And I don't want to know anything about it. But we have some background information that we can give you, though, in the form of the Michigan Open Book Project. So again, if you have an existing textbook in your classroom and it does not, for some reason, cover the Constitutional Convention, it seems like a funny thing not to include, but again, you may not even have a textbook in your classroom. This will provide a solid basis for your kiddos to start their learning from. Going forward, we also give you a graphic organizer to go through all the various plans. I'm going to bring that up right now. So the graphic organizer is digital, but feel free to print it out if you need to. You can choose to use this with students to do with their reading. And again, while we designed it specific to Michigan Open Book Project, insert name of your textbook here and it should work because your textbook is probably going to go over the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan, and then the big compromise. Particularly as we study these major plans that we highlight in the unit, it gives students something to focus in on that can kind of guide their reading even further. And even though the next lesson is also about compromises made, we approach that lesson kind of from a effects of the compromise standpoint. So here we spend a little time reconciling the different plans before we land the plane and get into the structure and function of government. So We have here 3 different sections in Open Book that provide you the tools for studying the 3 branches of government. I'm sorry, not an Open Book in Giants. This part really gets into the legislative branch. Then we move into the executive branch, and then we move into the judicial branch. Now, when studying the executive branch, we want you to have some preliminary discussions about the Electoral College. I am old enough to have lived through now 2 electoral college upsets now. So while it's a complex mechanism, we do need to start to get kids to understand what it is. And this is a 5th grade lesson. And this is a great time to look at what it is, why it was established, and listen to some arguments both for and against its continued practice. We'll never get the necessary constitutional amendment necessary to revise it in any way, shape, or form. So there's no real harm in having the conversation with kids about what could it look like if we got rid of it? What would it look like if we revised it? What would it look like if we, continue as it is currently? We also link you out to 270 to win. 270 to win is, I wish, I went to the Pink concert over the summer in Comerica Park. And my reason for bringing this up is that at one point, one of her opening singers sang one of the songs that they were famous for. And when Pink came up on stage and thanked them for opening for them, she said, yeah, half of the songs you sing, I wish I had written. And so Phil and I have done all of these clickable maps that we've linked you to throughout these units. And this is not one of the clickable maps that Phil and I designed. I wish we invented this one because this is a really cool website if you haven't seen it. So this is this is on the main page. You get to click and choose, and you get to say, okay, I think Michigan is going to, and you click, or not this particular one because this is based off of current projections, but you get to click and sort of change up the map a little bit here. Let me go to historical elections. So kids can create their own electoral map. There are ads here, and sometimes the ads are harder to click on. But if you wanted to give kids the opportunity to explore some of the historic maps, we have every presidential election from today all the way back to the very, very first one. So there's Washington again, there's Adams again, and so on. If you wanted them to really pull up and take a look at some of them, my favorites to display and include 1792. This is really the only time you have a unanimous. There is no recount going on in this particular election. It is not close. It is exactly 132 electoral votes in play, and they all ended up going to George Washington. So he got himself reelected quite swimmingly there. Other ones I like to take a look at include 1860. That is when the Civil War broke out. 1860, if I scroll back to it, is a very interesting map to look at. If it will load. 1860 is a very interesting map to look at. Lincoln was not even on the ballot in over 7 different states, and he still won. And you can probably guess which states he was not on the ballot for just by looking at this map. But I really like this one because you can have some great conversations about it. I also like 1932. So 1932 was 2 years into the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover was seeking re-election, and I think a message might have been sent. I watched a couple of your eyes got big. Lisa did the whole, but yeah. So yeah, a message might have been sent with that one. 1964 is another interesting one to take a look at. And I'm not going to get into the backstory on all of these things, but 1964, you've got some additional colors on here. 1972 is another interesting one to look at from the opposite end of things. That was Nixon v. McGovern. Good old Massachusetts and DC were like, we want McGovern. And the rest of the country was like, we want Nixon. And we also know how that one turned out. And then where do we go? 1992 is the other one that I find interesting to sort of take a look at. So, couple from different political slants. This is where you start to get a more leveled off 50-50. This is where things start getting closer after every election, which is why I chose 1992. So those are some ones you might choose to highlight with kids and talk a little bit about. But I love 270 to win, and it's fun to just go there and click around and play. So go there with your students, click around and play. And then for the judicial branch, we have a reading, we've got a graphic organizer, but we also have a great iCivics game called Supreme Court Decision Game. And I recommend you spend some time letting your students play with this. There isn't a stinker in the bunch when it comes to iCivics games. And while some might be a little further over kids' heads, do not discount the possibility that kids just tinkering with some of these games as a worthless throwaway activity that you've got 5-10 minutes at the end of a day for them to take a look at. We are in testing season and we are trying to balance that cognitive load. And even if they don't completely know what they're doing, they're able to tinker with and play with some of the iCivic stuff in a way that, is sort of non-threatening and probably to some degree a little bit soothing after a long day. So are there any questions about any of this before we take our break? All right, well, we are going to take a 5-minute break that will start at 5:15. And when we come back, I'm going to finish talking about lesson 3. And then I'm turning things over to Phil for a little while to talk about where do we put our capital, which those of you who've seen Hamilton know there was a song about this as well. So, you will be in the room where it happened after the break. So we'll see you in 5. Hey, Karen, while we're waiting for that last minute to pass, who's the dog? I waited till you took a bite of your sandwich to ask you that, of course.
That's Roscoe. He's a mutt.
Roscoe, you're a good boy.
He's looking for a bite of my sandwich.
That tracks.
Are you going to do 4th grade next year? Something like this for 4th grade?
That is the plan. We don't have dates yet, but they are Phil's wife and our Crackerjack teacher writer are working on things as we speak. So the plan is to do 4th grade. Yes.
Good. Looking forward to that. I might be moving to 4th grade, but if I'm not, I would like that background anyway, just to kind of know where the kids are and what they're coming in with. So.
And you still get my emails, right?
I do. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm hopeful to have some save the dates by the end of the year, but it may not come till August. But either way, yes, they're planning on doing them, and it'll be the same format. So
good.
All right, gang, we are back, and like I said, I'm closing up my section here, and we're going to move into Phil in just a minute. But the final lesson is on this: what compromises were reached at the Constitutional Convention. Now, Phil and I have had many a conversation this year in particular about some of our U.S. history compelling and supporting questions. When we first built these units, we developed these questions and we haven't really changed the questions much this time around. Didn't see a lot of need to. But when we started this year with 8th grade, so these questions, this compelling question and these supporting questions are pretty much verbatim Unit 0 in 8th grade. And when we started the year, Phil sent me an email one day saying, we have some massive problems we need to fix with 8th grade. And so I started to delve into them, and he, gave me, I love Phil's itemized lists because they are filled with like this and this and this and this. As I'm going through the points, I'm like, oh yeah, how did this slip by the radar? And then I remembered a lot of that was intentional. A lot of it was intentional because it's hard sometimes to talk about this plan and this plan without also talking about the compromises in line. I got my "the sky is falling" conversation with Phil out of the way, and we did end up restructuring some of 8th grade. But we have a similar problem to what Phil brought up before here. The difference is, I remember this time why we did it this way. So we talk about the major compromises for the structure of the Constitution in the previous lesson. This one talks about what was probably the greatest compromise at all, that took place after the Constitutional Convention, which is the Bill of Rights. So um, this lesson really covers the Bill of Rights. And it's a cool thing to like start to end your year with before you end with the coolest thing of all, which is Phil's "Where Do We Put Our Nation's Capital" activity, which he's going to go over in just a couple of minutes here. But the Bill of Rights is a tough document to grapple with. You can use the full text online, but we've also provided you a link to the Ducksters resource. I'm not always a fan of Ducksters. And of course, it's again not doing the loading thing right now. There it is. I'm not always a fan of Ducksters, but this particular one is totally fine. I'm not a fan of it for a couple of reasons. One is you get these ads embedded mid-page, and I'm like, oh, this would be perfect if not for some reason it thinks I need a wedding ring. Already married, dude, have one. So, I don't always like Ducksters from that standpoint. And some of my colleagues in the field, they're hit or miss about some of the things that are on the page. But you could also just as easily take the full text of the Bill of Rights and run it through an AI tool, as I've shown you how to do on a couple of areas here. But I like this one because this was intentionally done by a human to be a little more accessible to fifth graders. So I'm okay with this page, even though I don't always like Ducksters. We also provide you with a really cool graphic organizer to go along. And again, if they're doing this digitally, they can just make a copy in Google Docs and then type into it. And basically, as they read up and learn more about each amendment, I'm interested in their notes on what this amendment does and why it was important. When it's all done, we have this ranking column, and I want them to tell me which one they think was the most important in their mind and which one was the least important in their mind. And the big thing here is always why. Why do you feel like this one was the most important? Why do you think this one was the least important? So getting that why in there is important for them to really defend their point of view. It's one thing to have an opinion. We all have opinions on everything. It's another to back the opinion up with some form of evidence. And that's what we're trying to get kids to do here with this ranking column. So I would expect in Karen's classroom, if Karen were to say, Amendment 1, how many of you thought that was the most important one? Get a show of hands and then ask those hands, why did you pick that one as the most important? And then listen to the students, and their reasoning behind it. So there's two more tabs Dave Johnson's closing. We also get into the meaning of Amendment 10. Eighth grade, pretty much from sixth grade up, we use some of the John Green crash course videos linked inline because they're good. There's not a lot of need to edit them out. They're well done. They're well researched. They're well put together. But there wasn't one specifically on Amendment 10. So my other standby, if John Green doesn't have something, I always go over to Hip Hughes and see if Hip Hughes has it. Now, Hip Hughes teaches high school, so this one could go a little over students' heads. But I honestly, having previewed it again yesterday to do my final prep for this, I honestly don't think it does. It's good enough to show. It's about a 6-minute video. It's good enough to show, and again, have those discussions with kids. Why was Amendment 10 in particular so important? And keep in mind what I told you when we went over the Articles of Confederation at the beginning. Article 10 has its hints and echoes in Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Articles of Confederation. So it's a carryover from this piece that was obviously very important to our founding fathers. So call this out if you need to. Again, we're linking you, or we're telling you this would be a good opportunity to go to the thing that we can't physically link for you, but you can easily find if you need it. And then we end with, if you need it, a John Green crash course on the Constitution overall. John Green is good. I have only had to take down one of his videos out of our materials. It was from 7th grade, and he referred to some acts that He didn't refer to the axe as the axe, but every seventh grader knew exactly what he was talking about. And someone was like, "Hey, why is this in there?" And I felt a little odd about putting it in there to begin with. I just felt like it was a good summarizer, so I ended up taking it completely out. This one's okay, but I recommend that you slow the speed down on YouTube, so you are able to pull it up and you're able to change the speed at which it goes. John Green talks really fast. So if you hit play and if you go into the settings and change the playback speed, I recommend changing it down to 75%. And then he talks at a slightly more reasonable pace. Now, the video will also go a little bit longer, but he talks at a more reasonable pace if you turn that down. So, um, John Green also isn't for everyone. So preview it yourself first. And if you decide, yep, this is a good way to cap off my studies of the Constitution, great. And if not, no harm, no foul. You've done a pretty thorough job if you've been following some of the activities in this lesson already. So with that, Phil, I actually bought you an extra 5 minutes here if you need it. But with that, I'm going to close this final tab and I'm going to stop sharing my screen because the piece de resistance of the final unit of fifth grade giants actually belongs to Phil with the where do we put our capital presentation and activity set and all of that. So, Phil, take it away.
This is actually a surprisingly old lesson in that a NASA-funded project called Mission Geography that was supposed to link satellite imagery with geographic concepts came up with this topic, looked around and found a couple attempts to have a role-playing game about locating the capital, but they were very history-oriented. And the purpose of this is to sit at the end of a class in early American history as kind of the last big compromise, the one that kind of pushes us forward into the next era. But we didn't want it to be just about the history. If it's going to take the summary of a fifth grade social studies class, it really ought to incorporate what we've been doing in economics, what we've been doing in civics, and in my case, also what we've been doing in geography. And we found out that using the geographic idea as a lens lets you bring all of those ideas together. Now, that leaves open the question as to exactly when you'd run this thing. When we were in New York, the teachers voted overwhelmingly to run this in the last 2 weeks before the Regents exam because they could use it as a form of test prep for that. And I'd be curious as to exactly when and where people run this thing and how it worked in that slot. I don't know what to recommend here necessarily. I leave that over to you, and also leave over to you exactly how to structure it. Do you want to have it as small group doing a bunch of independent work first, and then coming together into a bigger group? To help support the activity, we've got 3 separate PowerPoints. One of them, called Locating the Capital, is designed to show the students. One of them is designed primarily as teacher background, and the third PowerPoint is a whole handful of individual frames that can be cut apart and put into other things to help build some of the individual skills. I'll show all 3 PowerPoints sort of in that order. Before we get to that, though, one last question to raise, and that is, how do you want your students to do presentations to each other? Should they just come back into a big group and try to come to a decision? Or should each of the groups, smaller groups, prepare some kind of formal presentation? And that means it could take 3 or 4 different forms. It could be an oral presentation. It could be a little mini play that they write. It could be a poster of some kind that they could either put on the wall or project, or it could be a short video. The idea is that different people are looking at different, but now I'm getting ahead of this first PowerPoint. So let me start the first PowerPoint. The year is 1790. The Constitution has been officially adopted. We've got a Bill of Rights. The country has survived as a union because of two great compromises that were built into the Constitution. The fact that we have different representation in the House and Senate. Unable to decide between Virginia and New Jersey, we said, okay, both. And counting only 3/5 of the slaves, which is a giant kick of a can toward the Civil War. That'll become a big theme in 8th grade. 3 years later, people realized that we needed another compromise desperately because there was a difficult question that the Constitutional Convention was not able to answer. Where do we put this capital? And like I say, I'm not so much about the content of the question. I'm about using the question and the fact that it is somehow interesting to kids as a way to review economics, civics, history, geography, all the way through the 5th grade class. Because I've watched this thing happen in a couple dozen classes, and it does work. Part of the problem is that there's this very popular history narrative about how Tommy Jefferson invited Alex Hamilton and Jimmy Madison, and we're all going to go over to my house for dinner, and we'll tip a few cups of beer or mead or something like that, and we'll figure it all out. And to be frank, that just sounds too easy. Did it really work that way? Or was there something else going on inside? And I'm going to suggest there was something else going on that made the compromise not only even easier than that, but a terribly easy sell afterwards. Unlike, for example, trying to sell the idea of, $60 billion for Ukraine. So let's keep that story in mind while you explore the geography of this country that has just become what it is. We're going to use specific ideas from geographic analysis as a way to explore the compromise in terms of its economics, civics, and history. It also might show why this compromise and its ongoing refusal to address some of other important issues eventually led to the Civil War and continues to influence voting up to today. So, the package of materials that you've got, in addition to the 3 PowerPoints, it's got a teacher's guide, and then it's got the big worksheets. And the big worksheets are 9 separate pages. And each of the small groups is going to get 1, 2, or 3 maps. Each of the maps has some specific instructions, and the instructions are designed to address specific Michigan and Common Core standards in history, geography, economics, and tellingly in math. So it can't be easily pushed off the table by the people that want to say, oh man, we're getting real close to the assessment time. We're going to have to really focus on reading and math to make sure that they get it. And we social studies teachers can nod our heads and say, yep, that's exactly what we're doing. We're focusing on teaching math in a way that the kids will actually remember it. Now, that may be fighting words in some schools. And my general reaction is, so be it. Each of these maps has a specific bit of information about colonial geography because it's a map. So the instructions focus on different skills. And this is where I said, in choosing how you set up your groups, you might do a little bit of diagnosis that the students who really are pretty good at the math so far, you know, they know how to do the bar graphs and so on. You might give them one of the other ones, like the one about topographic associations. On the other hand, if you've got some students that are still challenged by math, we'll show you that there are a couple of them that have very specific, you know, how to calculate a percentage, how to make a bar graph, and so on. So one group gets a map that has a bunch of inset graphs of climate. Their task is really very simple, and that is to count the number of months when government office work might be hindered by the fact that it was either too hot, too cold, or there'd be too much snow or rain, and it would be hard to get to the work. Because there was a very active group of people that did not want the capital located in a couple places. They did not want it located north of Boston, anywhere, New Hampshire, any place like that, because they didn't want to have to travel in the wintertime in order to get up to do the work, and they didn't want to have to even try to commute from home or wherever they were staying, and so on. There was another very vocal group who realized that it wasn't just 6 really hot months. I mean, months where the low temperature was 70 degrees and the high was over 90, that it wasn't just those hot months, but that those hot months were associated with some other things like yellow fever, mosquitoes, fevers of different kinds, and so on. That's one group. They're taking a look at the climate. They're taking a look at specific parts of the climate. I should actually back up. They're reading a particular kind of climate graph that has these bars set across it. So they have to, you know, this is something to give to your science-oriented students. The second group is given a table of the territories of the states at the time and their populations. And their job is to finish a bar graph and then mark a place that they think is close to the center of the population. And that can be eyeballing it on the map, or it can be finding the center by adding up all the numbers from this end and from this end. And in either case, you're going to wind up having the center be, well, in a particular place that is worth noting. A third group tries to evaluate the influence of big cities. This is kind of the Jefferson versus Hamilton subtext argument. Hamilton being a real city person, loving New York, and Jefferson kind of not trusting cities, not trusting what they do to people, not trusting who works there, thinking that the rural population has got their handle on things a little bit better. Is that a topic that we hear resonating in 2024? In any case, they're trying to do that. Another group focuses on the geographic concept of region. And to do that, they finish a much simpler bar graph, and then they color up the map using the data from the graph. They color the map in order to find the region of slavery. Another group evaluates the individual colonies in terms of the major products that they had. It's looking at the local economy in those different colonies and seeing what aspects of that economy are likely to influence their attitudes toward politics, toward ideas like taxation or free trade or commerce, tariffs, all of these economic concepts. And then finally, a group is trying to figure out which colonies are making money by looking at the exports and the imports from each of these colonies. And group number 9 is looking at the debt that each colony had at the time, and then its population which was used to calculate what would be their fair share of the total debt. And we'll see how that difference plays out. So like I say, each one of these has got a simple map to make, a particular mathematical skill to do, read a graph, make a graph, make a bar graph, count population, so on. And then they can come back together and make some kind of a presentation to each other, or just start a discussion and see where it goes. Because after they've chosen the location for the capital based on just the information that they've got as their own separate page. Now, historically, we should point out that during the discussions about the Constitutional Convention, at least one delegate mentioned every single one of these individual variables as the major influence on his or her vote about the location of that capital. So these are not things that we've made up in the 21st century and kind of retrofitted onto history. These are the opinions that people in different parts of the colonies had at the time. And then finally, the groups get together, compare information, and try to choose a compromise location. Try to figure out where we're going to put the capital. The teacher packet, which we'll look at in just a minute here, includes some visual aids to demonstrate each skill, and it has the sample answers for each one of the work maps or the graphs. And when it's all done, we could try to identify what message we might learn in 2024 from the Great Compromise. Specifically, we can apply what can we apply out of this compromise to the present Congress, which seems to have much more difficulty coming up to compromise. In other words, are things different now, or was the question just a whole lot different at the time? Like I say, this was adapted from an activity started by the Mission Geography Project. And it's been updated a number of times because we used it in New York as teacher prep for the Regents exam. So with that, you've got the basic framework for the activity. You've got the individual handout sheets. Do you have to use all 9 of them? And my answer is no, not necessarily. But the main point of the story gets stronger when you've got more different kinds of information brought to bear on this compromise. So there's a good argument for using at least 7 or 8 of them. And with that, let's take a look at the answer key for some of these. The answer key for the climate one, number 2, is that Washington turned out to have the fewest number of bad months of all of the possible candidate places. So if that's your only variable, you just want to have the weather be good, Washington, D.C., in a time before air conditioning was invented, in the time before central heating, in the time before we had mechanized snowplows, and so on, Washington was the place to put it. So, but we shouldn't stop there, because you could take that activity and use that as a springboard to review some of the things that we've been talking about all along that are related to climate, like where are those infertile soils called altisols, the ones that just don't produce very well. Where do you grow cotton, which takes 10 times as much labor as corn does to grow? And then something that's going to become increasingly important as we go into 8th grade, where are things like yellow fever, mosquito-borne diseases, hookworm, things like that? Now, because if you notice, when you compare that map of the red soils over here with the map of yellow fever, the maps are essentially identical because they're both related to each other through that mediating variable of climate. So each one of these can then be used as a springboard to review some of these other concepts, either didactically or Socratically or however you choose to do it. So one of the groups was looking at topography, and we emphasized earlier on that the location of good mill sites, places where you could saw lumber, where you could grind corn, where you could basically start industries at different times. And a surprising number of the candidates for the capital were those places that were located where they could have a water wheel, a mill that would be a source of power. The group that was looking at the population, when they finish their graph over here, and then they start counting the bars up here and adding them up, they wind up having a location of the capital that should be somewhere in the southern part of Pennsylvania. But that's the middle of the population. Or you could have just done that the simple way to take a look at the dot map of population that's on your clickable map and try to find the middle of it. And that middle comes in somewhere in the southern part of Pennsylvania. The group that was looking at the cities and where they were and putting the cities into groups and then putting the cities onto a map and seeing where they were, wound up with, well, it's probably better to make 10 the break point between small, medium, and large cities. And then you make a great big circle for the large cities here, and they were generally north, with the exception of Charleston. And I said, what message do we get out of this? Well, one of the messages that came out of the Constitutional Convention was they did not want the capital to be in any of the places that had already been the capital or were already big and prosperous. And that pretty well ruled out all those big cities there and said, we're going to have to look for another one somewhere else. No, like I say, that is probably the most abstract of all of these variables here, but it was a recurring theme at the convention. Not to have it in a city that was already economically or politically powerful, to have it somewhere else, some other place that could basically focus just on governing the country. The group that was making the slavery map would start out by making a graph like that, and that turns out to be roughly the line between the free and the slave regions, somewhere in the southern part of Pennsylvania. That's very obvious when you color the maps according to the key that they have. And they've got one of the easiest presentations of all of the groups because it is such a clear colored pattern like that. We could also use the online clickable maps. And, you know, the clickable maps had the advantage that you could put 2 or 3 variables together at a time so that you can put the total population and the slave population on top of it on this one here. And you can see that that line is about right there. It's pretty obvious when you show just the slave population. And then if I could tie that back to the climate map a little bit earlier on, if you put the slave population on top of those red soils, the ones that were unproductive because it was too hot and rainy in that spot, you could see that basically slavery started just about where those bad soils raised the labor requirements for your agriculture and made plantations a more logical way for the people to try to organize their economy, at least in their minds at the time. Trade shows the same pattern, but in reverse. That is, those states in the South that were growing things like cotton and tobacco and indigo were actually able to sell them onto the international market. Whereas the states in the north that were producing wheat and dairy products and iron and things like that, they were producing primarily for their own domestic market. And they wound up importing a whole lot more than they exported, whereas the South was exporting more than it was importing. And that line that comes between those two, it's somewhere in the southern part of Pennsylvania. You could do the same thing with the clickable maps. And again, you can turn on different products here. These were the products that could be sold on the international market, and therefore the ones that were making money from imports, the ones who therefore did not want to have, tariffs on imports and things like that. These were the products that were primarily for the domestic market. And then when you put those on as arrows of trade, you can see, big arrows coming in and small arrows going out. And then when you get down to the southern part, you've got bigger arrows going out. Again, a graphic way of showing that pattern. And then when we finally take a look at the debt coming out of the Revolutionary War, the millions of dollars that each state owed, and then taking their population and calculating their fair share. And the student's job is just to find the difference, and then to put plus and minus signs on a map here. The big division between debtor and creditor regions shows up in, guess where? The southern part of Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland. That shows up when you put them on the map. These are the states that owed more. These are the states that owed less compared to their fair share. Now, so that myth goes that Jefferson got Hamilton and Madison together and they had their supper and they came up with their compromise and they went back to the convention and they said, this is what we think we ought to do. The geographic story that I want to add to that is that this compromise was an exceptionally easy sell, because the selection of a place in the northern end of Virginia near the southern end of Pennsylvania, nobody from the South wanted it in Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania was stridently anti-slavery. So it could not be in Pennsylvania, but to be close to Pennsylvania in either Maryland or Virginia turns out to be the preferred location, whether you look at the climate, the mill sites, the population, the cities, the products, slavery, the trade relationships, or the debt. In other words, they came back with their idea of a compromise, and it was an extremely easy sell because practically everybody in the room had come to the same conclusion that that's about where the capital ought to be, regardless of whether you use climate, debt, trade, population as your criteria for that location. So the third PowerPoint you can look at just from the side over there is just a bunch of overhead transparencies that teachers in New York had designed at first, ending up with an overhead transparency about Jefferson's letter about debt, what he thought was producing the most bitter and angry contest ever known in Congress. Hamilton was in despair. I met him on the street, painted pathetically the temper, and so on. Like I say, the third PowerPoint is just a handful of images that some teachers in New York thought were useful. And so I just kind of recopied them over here and tweaked the language a little bit and shortened the text a little bit and made them available. If you think you can borrow them, you snip them out. So 3 PowerPoints and a package of activities. something that can be done in 2 days, one day of group and then one day of discussion, or it could be stretched out over a couple weeks and used as a way of reviewing a whole lot of ideas, like the climate, like the mill sites, like the population, like the immigration, like what ethnic groups were coming to different places, and that big question about slavery. And we still have the 5 minutes that Dave gave me left over, so ask me a question if you got one.
So if you are looking at your clocks right now, you will see that it is 6:25. So we are almost done for the evening. But I wanted to, first of all, figure out what the heck it is that I'm sharing right now, because it is not what I wanted to share. There we go. All right. So No Good Giants rollout is complete without a quick overview of the assessment for each unit. So in this particular case, we have again an assessment that in this particular case has 25 questions, but you look at this and it's across 9 slides or 9 pages. And in this particular case, the first 9 are this very first question, where we're asking them to take a look at the Articles of Confederation. Again, think back to what it was that they learned over the course of this unit about them, particularly back in lesson 1. And for each one, they're going to type in, this was a power reserved for the national government or a power reserved for both. So the first 10 questions here, this should say questions 1 through 10. I'll have to fix that in a minute. Fix it in post, as they say. So the first one encompasses 10 questions here. And this one is a select all that applies. So in this one, this is another type of question that has crept into the M-Step these days, where there's not just one answer, there could be multiple answers. So again, in this particular case, we get into Washington speech that Washington gave here that is also over some of the problems with the Articles of Confederation. And again, we need kids to, in this case, remember which of these were some of those major problems that were discussed. Some of them are problems that were discussed, and some of them are other problems that weren't necessarily part of that overall conversation. So the key here will be to select all that apply. James Madison, something similar. And again, he is referring to some very specific things here. So it's asking them to take a look at the quote and again, tell you which problem specifically Madison is describing here. Then we get into one final, as if having all these other questions on the Articles of Confederation wasn't enough. We've got one final question that takes us about halfway through this assessment to basically have kids type out which 3. Now, if you remember earlier with the graphic organizer, we asked them to rank. Now we're asking them to pick their top 3. And they could be the same ones that they picked earlier, or they could go, you know what, in hindsight, or more likely it won't be, you know what, in hindsight, it'll be, oh yeah, I did an activity, I'm not going to remember it here. So looking at this list, here are the 3 that I think are the biggest problem. Whichever one happens, that's fine. We're asking them to go back and explain how some of these things were solved. So pick 3 of the problems listed above and explain how the founders attempted to solve them in the new Constitution. So this is our bridge question between Articles of Confederation and into Constitutional Convention. Then we're asking students to basically type the text here that might go into this particular chart. So, what was the New Jersey plan? What were the highlights? I would use your best judgment for each kid. Some of your higher flyers, I would expect to include more bullet points here. Some of your lower population that may need a little bit of adaptation, I would say go ahead and give them the benefit of the doubt. If they don't list everything, but they've got a couple of strong points from each of these plans, that's good. Also talk a little bit about the 3/5 compromise here. This one also leads into the 3/5 compromise. Explain how the 3/5 compromise brought the two sides together. Extra bonus points. This would be the 4 on the Marzano scale if you're in a Marzano district. Extra bonus points if they could also talk about how the 3/5 compromise created a lot of problems, because that was also, part of the soup du jour here. We got a timeline here. Pick one event from the timeline and explain why it caused the founding fathers to create a weak central government as part of the Articles of Confederation. We have a question here that asks kids to sort which of these in the Constitution were powers delegated to the national government or the states' governments. And then finally, describe the reason for the inclusion of the Bill of Rights. Use your knowledge of history and any other text or document from this assessment. So kids will write. So there's a little more writing on this one, but one of my major problems with the M-STEP itself is the fact that there is no written component, and you just can't do a great job of really getting to the root of what kids know with just straight up multiple choice questions. You've got to probe a little bit deeper, and some of those DOK levels just can't be assessed with a multiple choice. So we run the gamut, and the assessment again is available here for you to use, and use it freely, use it widely. So now that it is 6:30, what I would like to do is open up for one last round of questions before we stop the recording and go into the official question session. Phil, your clock is wrong. All right. Hearing none, Phil and I in just a minute are going to open up the Q&A session that we do for that final hour every night for those of you who need it. But before we do, for those of you who are going to say goodbye, I would like to thank all of you. Hello. I would like to thank all of you for sticking with us this year. We had some great rollouts. We had some where obviously there were some other things on Dave's mind, but we did some great work together. These recaps will be up and available for all of perpetuity because unlike Adobe Connect, I don't see YouTube going anywhere anytime soon. Phil may have other from his vast years of experience. No, I did not just call you old, but Phil may have some other ideas about the longevity of some of the things that we utilize today. But I have 9 bloodborne pathogen videos left before I'm eligible to retire, and I have a feeling that YouTube will be around for all of them. After that, I'll be retired, so I don't know what will happen, and nor will I care. But we'll also probably be operating under new standards by then too, so who knows. But my point, thank you for all of your time and attention. If you need anything in the future, don't hesitate to reach out. Like I said before, I'm going to get sketches processing starting tomorrow, starting Thursday. Look for the email, and if you notice a discrepancy, email me and ignore my vacation responder, and at some point in May, I will get your email and we'll take care of it. Thank you for everything. Have a great night, and we'll see you soon.